I'm Matt Landau, and this is Unlocked. We're preparing to launch Season 7, and we're super excited about it. But to keep things fresh, we decided to produce a special episode of our Divergent Thinking series, in which we challenge you to apply lessons from adjacent industries back to the one that we call home. We featured people like Nathan Schneider, one of the world's leading experts on cooperatives, a different kind of corporation that's owned by its stakeholders, in episode 75. And Louis Rosenberg, the brain behind Swarm Intelligence, how strength in numbers helps animals survive in the wild and can help us too, in episode 81. Bob Pease is the president of the Brewers Association, which unites craft beer companies in the United States. And if you subscribe to VRMB's weekly newsletter, you know we've been borderline obsessed with the craft beer movement of late in trying to find industries that our highly fragmented sector can emulate. Now, as you'll hear from Bob, the craft brew movement has some almost eerie similarities to vacation rentals. Each beer's personality and the people behind it are its greatest strength. It's all small, independent brewers who have distinguished themselves from big corporations and have meaningful roles in their communities. And it's a sector with tremendous tailwinds, driven by consumer demands for something other than the status quo. In this interview, we talk about the importance of working together when your competition is Anheuser-Busch or Airbnb. The simple, magical role a small business can have in its local landscape, and why no one else is going to do this industry unifying work for us. It's the passionate little people who must drive the ship. Okay, here's the interview with Bob, and a quick shout out to Garrett Marrero of Maui Brewing Company, one of the absolute coolest, most community-oriented craft brewers in America, who connected us with Bob, and Inner Circle members Billy Dirksen and Marcy Cortez, who introduced us to Garrett in the first place. Aloha, mahalo, let's go.
The Brewers Association is the not-for-profit trade association that represents the over now 8,000 small and independent craft breweries operating in the United States. Our mission is to promote and to protect American craft breweries, their beers, and the community of brewing enthusiasts. So we're a national trade association. Unlike most associations that are based in Washington, D.C., we're based in Boulder, Colorado. And we are engaged in a number of different programs and activities on behalf of our members that help us fulfill that mission of promote and protect. So an example of some of our promotional activities would be we do some pretty large events showcasing craft breweries and their beers to the beer drinking public. The one with the biggest name recognition is an event called the Great American Beer Festival. So we do that every year in Denver. Unfortunately, not last year and not this year, but we'll be back in 2022 for our 40th anniversary. And that's an event that draws about 60,000 beer lovers to downtown Denver over the course of 3 days, where we put on 4 festival sessions that typically have about 800 breweries on the convention center floor, with showcasing about 3,000 different beers. And the whole idea behind that is to just celebrate American craft beer culture. So that would be one example of what we do on the promote side. On the protect side, we are very active in what we call government affairs on behalf of our members' interests at the federal level and at the state level. In beverage alcohol, most of the activities in terms of government regulation, government legislation does happen at the state level, but we are also very active at the federal level in Washington, D.C. I'm a registered lobbyist on behalf of the craft brewing industry and travel regularly, regularly to Washington to meet with legislators and policymakers and to advocate for issues that are in the interests of our members. So I could go on and on, but I'm sure we want to get to other questions. But that's just a kind of a 40,000-foot view of some of what the Brewers Association does. And I guess before I move off of that topic, I will say, at our core, we're a membership organization, right? So we generate revenue by having breweries join the Brewers Association as a dues-paying member. Right now, we have somewhere, I think, close to between 5,500 and 6,000 breweries as members of the Brewers Association. So it's right around somewhere between 65 and 70% of all the breweries in the United States are members of the BA.
And do they all pay the same amount in dues?
Great question. No, they do not. They pay, their dues are based on volume. So what I mean by that is the more beer that you make or produce each year, the higher your dues. And so our dues structure ranges from $195 for the smallest brewery to up to $15,000 for the largest brewery.
And I'm guessing that might be describing our mutual friend Garrett there in Maui Brewing Company. Is he one of the largest?
He is not. He is not. He's in the top 50, I think, or top 100. But in the beer industry, volume is measured by barrels. So a barrel of beer is the unit of measure in the beer world. If you used to go to a party in college and there was a keg of beer,
that's exactly where my brain went.
Typically, that was a half barrel, 15.5 gallons.
Yeah, but I think you would poo-poo the kind of beer that we were drinking back then.
I think we all did that, right, Matt? So a barrel of beer is 31 gallons, and the largest craft breweries produce somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 million barrels of beer. Those are the exceptions. A brewery like Sierra Nevada, for example, they produce right around 1 million barrels of beer a year. And then Maui Brewing, Garrett's Brewery, I think they're right around 80,000 barrels, somewhere in that neighborhood. So it's not. And then most craft breweries, the overwhelming majority of craft breweries are very, very small and produce 5,000 barrels of beer a year or less. So it's very local, very, very small, very family centric. These are the vast majority of breweries, small and independent, local Main Street businesses, typically employing between 10 and 50 people. And I think the median production is somewhere around 600 barrels. So very, very small. But a brewery like Garrett's, obviously very successful, active in a lot of different areas, and certainly one of our leaders in the community.
What are some of the challenges that those small breweries face? Because I'm applying it now to our industry. Our unit of measurement is a property. And in some cases, that's a 1-bedroom home. In some cases, that's a large 10-bedroom home. In some cases, it's in a city. In other cases, it's in a mountain. What are these challenges that the small folks in the industry need help solving?
Well, that is not an easy question to answer. How I'll start by saying is it depends on the business model of the brewery.
Okay.
A brewery like Maui Brewing Company is we classify them as a packaging brewery, meaning that the majority of their beer production is put into bottles, cans, or kegs, and then sold for distribution at retail.
Okay.
So that's one business model. That's going to be, where are you guys located?
I'm in Miami. Stewart and production is in Central America and Panama, but the majority of our colleagues are located throughout the world.
So, I'm just looking for examples of other production craft breweries. Sierra Nevada is a packaging brewery. Brooklyn Brewery. Those are what we call packaging breweries.
Okay.
There are two other business models. One is if a brew pub, and that's a restaurant brewery, and that means that they are brewing their beer on site, and the majority of the beer that they produce is consumed on site. And they have a significant food or kitchen operation. So that's the second business model. Then the third business model is what we call a tap room, and that is a brewery where beer is produced on site, and there's typically no kitchen or food operation. Often those businesses partner with a food truck or something of that sort, and they sell all of the beer that they make right on site. So, three different business models: packaging brewery, brew pub slash restaurant brewery, or tap room. And the challenges for all three of those breweries' business models are different. Um, for and where we spend a lot of our effort and focus, and at least in terms of government affairs, is focusing on what we call access to market for a packaging brewery like Maui. Beer is heavily regulated, it's heavily taxed, like all beverage alcohol, and getting your beer to either the shelf of the grocery store, the liquor store where they sell your beer in bottles or cans, or to get your beer on tap at a restaurant or brewery is very, very challenging for small and independent brewers. And the playing field is tilted in the direction and favors the large international breweries that dominate America's beer scene. So we spend a lot of our time fighting for what we call access to market issues so that the beer drinker determines what gets on the shelf or what gets on the tap, and those choices are not dictated by large brewers or, in our world, what are known as beer distributors. In most states, beer has to go through what is called the three-tier system. And stop me whenever if I'm going too far down the rabbit hole. For
No, I'm totally engaged.
in many states, and again, every state is different. So 50 sets of state laws, but in most states, uh, a brewery, Bob's Brewery or Matt's Brewery, produces all this beer at their brewery, puts it in bottles, cans, or kegs. You cannot sell that beer directly to Stewart's Bar or Stewart's Restaurant. You have to go through a middleman, a beer distributor, and they are outstanding at what they do. It's a very beer distribution business is very hard. It's very expensive to set up, and so in most cases, that relationship between the beer producer, what we call the supplier, and the distributor works pretty well. But in many states as well, uh, when you sign a distribution agreement, say Matt's Brewery signs with Stewart's distributing company to distribute your beer in certain parts of Florida, and again, this varies state by state, but Matt's Brewery is basically going to be tied to Stewart's distribution company in perpetuity, forever. And you cannot get out of that relationship. And that's really hard to fathom and wrap your head around when you tell people that. they think this is America, man. That can't be right. But it's true. There are laws. They're called franchise laws at the state level that supersede the contract that Matt and Stewart entered into. And if Matt wants to leave Stewart's distribution company and go to Bob's distribution company, it is very, very difficult to do. And so we spend a lot of our time trying to change those laws, what are called franchise laws, to give our members greater access to market.
I love that. I mean, the only sort of immediate parallel that comes to mind for the independent property owners and property managers in terms of distribution are what we call OTAs, the listing sites, the VRBOs and the Airbnbs and the booking.coms of the world, which most owners and managers use to distribute their product as far and wide as possible because these platforms have the most reach. However, it's a very delicate balance because if you become too dependent on those platforms and they change any rules or ban you from a platform or change their algorithm, your quote unquote business is completely untethered. So I think a lot of our owners and managers listening are thinking to themselves about that same kind of independence, about that same sort of control. You touched on something that I thought was also very relevant, which is the consumer demand for craft beer. Is that ultimately what drives everything forward in your industry?
Yes. Right now in the United States, small and independent craft breweries, and I think hopefully we'll touch on this later in the discussion, but we should talk about what I mean by when I say a small and independent craft brewery. But right now, small and independent craft breweries in the United States have 14% of the market share by volume. So for every 100 beers that are sold in this country, 14 of them are produced by a small and independent brewery. Um, so that's one very, I think interesting data point for us. A second one would be that right now I think that we have 14% of the market by volume, but our members have, I think it's 24% of the market by dollar.
Wow.
Craft breweries, craft beers produced by craft breweries typically cost a little bit more. It has a bit of a higher price point. So 14% of the market by volume, let's just say 25% of the volume by dollars. And that it didn't always used to be like that, right? I mean, it's taken 20 years plus to get to that point where we have 14% of the market by volume. And a lot of that comes from education of the beer drinker. The beer drinker in America has, discovered this all started happening in the 80s and the 90s, but discovered flavor, understood that there was more to beer than industrial light lager. That's the brand, this beer style, beer style that is made by primarily made by the large multinational brewers. It's an excellent style. I drink it all the time, but there is more to beer than just one beer style. And what happened in this country in post World War II was beer got commoditized, and it was, produced and marketed as not a product of meaning and not a product of flavor. And that worked for 30, 40 years, but in the 80s and 90s, the beer drinker discovered flavor. Then they discovered hops through the collective educational efforts of the Brewers Association and all of our members. Beer drinkers realized there was more to beer than just than light lager. Kind of like the similar parallels, Matt, to what's happened, say, with coffee or cheese, bread, ice cream, perhaps what's happening in your industry. But, consumers wanted to support small and local independent businesses, and they wanted beers with more flavor. They wanted to, know the people that were behind the brands they were supporting. And all of those things happened and continue to happen. And those are all market conditions that are favorable to our members.
So our industry is at a very interesting crossroads right now. As a result of the pandemic, a lot of travelers are exploring vacation rentals for the first time, and category awareness is rising faster than it ever has before. A standalone home where you don't have to interact with others. In a lot of cases, a rural destination or a beach destination, so you have your own air and space. If the consumer is increasingly finding vacation rentals as an alternative accommodation, something that they like, How do we go about defining that small and independent nature? Or at least how do you guys do it?
Yeah, and that was a seminal moment for our association and our industry, and lots of passion, lots of discussion, lots of arguments. But eventually, and this was all this these decisions and discussions were, really led by our board of directors and our senior staff. But it became really, really apparent that, we needed to define and articulate who is it that we represent. And so we make the very careful distinction all the time, every day, to say we don't define craft beer. That's up to the beer drinker. What we do is we do define and articulate who is a craft brewer. And for us, that means they need to be small and they need to be independent. And we have metrics around both of those terms, small and independent. But that definition makes no value judgment on the beer produced by breweries that don't meet our definition. But what kind of triggered that, Matt, and the need to do that was, for years and years and years, the large breweries in this country, Anheuser-Busch InBev, Molson Coors, uh, they they controlled the beer market by volume and they controlled it by distribution. But then in the 80s and 90s, small and independent breweries start popping up. They start to capture the fancy of the beer consumer, and they start capturing the dollar share of the beer consumer too. And so what the large breweries did in response, after pretty much failing at their own efforts to produce their own craft beers, they started to buy up leading independent craft breweries. And so that means, Matt might have started his brewery in 1990. It makes great beer. It grows to a certain volume, and then you have the opportunity to cash out, to sell to the biggest player in your space. And nothing wrong with that. That's the American dream, right? In many industries. But what ended up happening there, though, was Anheuser-Busch InBev primarily, but a little bit of Miller and Coors. They bought craft breweries, fine, paid the owners handsomely. They achieved one of their aspirations. But the large breweries then also started to market um, these the breweries they had acquired as being small and independent or local. And that's really what motivated us to create our definition of a craft brewer. We have produced a seal that only craft brewers can put on their packaging so the beer drinker knows who is a craft brewer and who isn't. Um, because there's a difference between a brewery that is owned by a large multinational corporation and a brewery that is owned by Matt on Main Street. And we represent the breweries on Main Street.
And what are the main differences in terms of impact in local community?
Well, one of the reasons that small breweries have had such success over the last 20 years is that they are tied to the local community fabric. Small breweries are often gathering places for not just beer drinkers, but all sorts of social and community entities that need a place to meet. Craft breweries are typically very, very engaged in philanthropic activities in their community. They employ, your family, your friends, your neighbors, um, and they have really, and then the beer drinker really, really likes to be able to talk to the woman or man who made the beer that they're drinking. That is a key fundamental difference that small and independent breweries have over large multinational corporations, and that has really resonated with the beer drinker.
So would it be fair to say that there was one part of defining exactly who was the small and independent brewers, but another part of it was defining who we are not.
Sure. Yes.
Is that part of the focus with the Brewers Association?
Absolutely. All beer is good. We have a lot in common. The Brewers Association does with uh, large and independent. Large multinational breweries, and we work cooperatively with them on many issues. But the entire marketplace is tilted in the favor of the largest players. They have advantages of economies of scale. They have advantages of incredible buying power, and then most importantly, they have advantages, which I've spoken about a little bit previously, of what we call access to market. When you go into a grocery store or a beer store and you see a 30 pack, a 24 pack, an 18 pack, a 12 pack, a 6 pack of the same beer brand, you can't tell me that that is because that is what the beer drinker or the consumer is demanding. That those choices are being made for the beer drinker by the large breweries and the people that do what we call the self shelf setting in a grocery store or a liquor store. And those people are called category captains, and they are typically employed by the largest brewers. And so that is what, you know, that is how, uh, that is something that we, work very hard to try to educate purchasers and decision makers why that might not be in their best interest, that they might make more money if they had, fewer, uh, allocated less real estate to the same brand in all these different package sizes, and instead provided the beer drinker with a greater variety of choice. And the situation there, Matt, has changed unbelievably, an unbelievable amount. I mean, nowadays you go to a grocery store, a beer store, you see a lot of choice for small and independent craft brewers. So we have had, phenomenal success, and that has been driven mainly by the beer drinker. But there is still a lot of work to be done.
And is there any big thing that you've learned on you've used the word educate a couple times? Educate the category captain, educate the beer drinker. Is there any big thing that you've learned in terms of how to best educate these people? Because we're not professors or educators by trade.
Yeah, great question. Nobody likes to be told that the choices they're making are bad. So, if you can't say, hey, you should not be drinking that. That's because blah 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 blah. That's the biggest turnoff and the biggest way not to open up somebody's mind. You've got to try to find ways to engage the beer drinker, engage the consumer, and find out what their interests are, where their interests lie. I've had so many conversations over my career with people that are like, "Well, I don't really like beer," and then you're like, "Okay, I get
Do
that."
they know who they're talking to?
Sure, sure. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Uh, but then you just say, well, okay, what do you like? Well, I like wine. If we're talking about beverage alcohol, great. What kind of wine do you like? And once they tell me that, I can find a beer style that invariably opens up their mind to the possibilities. And so instead of saying you shouldn't be drinking light lager, or, you know, it's kind of like that. You just want to open up that door of exploration and discovery and kind of just nudge them through it without telling them what they're doing is wrong.
Mm,
And I think that is the biggest key to successful education.
I love that. I want to turn a little bit towards specialization. I often use the original cottage industry as kind of the roots of what we do. which started off really people hand making products, whether it's locks or clothing or shoes, in their home by hand, selling it to a distributor who eventually would go on to create a factory and have no need for the cottage industry anymore. We're kind of bringing that back a little bit. We are focusing on the specialties, whether it's a location or a specific property niche. When it comes to specialization in your field, does that tend to foster collaboration amongst local stakeholders? Because I've often found in our space independent owners and managers that are located in a particular place or for whatever reason see each other as competition don't work together quite so much, but maybe it's because they're not specializing enough.
In the craft beer community, Matt, collaboration is one of our calling cards. It's one of our hallmarks. There is a phenomenon known as collaboration brews. And what that means is Matt's brewery works with Stewart's brewery. You go to one of your two respective breweries and you make a beer together.
Like a mixtape.
And then you each sell it.
Huh.
So collaboration and cooperation is a big part of the craft brewing community. It's one of the things that I like best about our community is that, yes, these entities and these businesses are competitors for sure. But I think the mentality is that we only have 14% collectively of the market by volume. There is still a lot of market share out there to be had for small and independent brewers. So I don't know if it was really specialization that led to that, that for collaboration to become one of our calling cards. I think it was more, we're, together. There's a phrase in our industry is like, together we are heavy, and we need to band together. And I don't want to say, fight against the enemy, but we have more in common than we do apart. And that has really, people are amazed when they go and are immersed in our world and our culture and see the amount of cooperation and collaboration that exists between craft breweries. It's really inspiring to see.
Quick beer break, guys. If you're drawing connections in your mind about how we, as independent vacation rental professionals, can follow in the path that the craft brewers have, you cannot resist one simple fact. We must unite together. And we must do so behind fearless leaders who defend our businesses, our craft, and our livelihoods. One great way to do this is the Vacation Rental Management Association, who's actively welcoming professional companies of all sizes, including yours. VRMA International's event this year will be the biggest in history, and we need to have you there. Another way is to join our solution, VRMB Communities, an online forum where nearly 1,000 independent vacation rental owners and managers are actively problem solving, and we're doing so together. You can sign up at community.vrmb.com/register. Let's get back to the interview. The Brewers Association is managed by an industry association management firm, or is it a completely independent leadership team?
Completely independent leadership team. We are, we're strategically governed by a 21-person board of directors. Those are the members of the board are typically women and men who are brewery owners, and then they are elected to the board and in their respective membership class. And those membership classes, and we touched upon this earlier, are packaging breweries have a certain amount of seats on the board, brew pub breweries have a certain number of seats on the board, and taproom breweries have a number of seats on the board. And then from there, we have a staff of 42 that are under my direction. So I take the strategic direction from the board, and then I work with my management team to come up with an annual plan and an annual budget, and then we go out and we execute that plan and that budget on behalf of our members.
Do you think that there's consequences or differences in terms of results that an independent group like you just described is able to achieve versus what our industry uses? And I'm not trying to critique it at all. In fact, it's by far the most progress that has been made, is an industry association management group that manages the VRMA. Many of their members we know and work with regularly. Is there something about the DNA of the Brewers Association leadership that you think is able to achieve anything different, or is it just different strokes for different industry?
Well, I don't have direct experience with the other management model. There are a couple of other beer trade associations that are managed by a third party entity. Um, I think we have always just found that you get more passion, you get more commitment if there are if your staff is people that you've handpicked, and that's you surround yourself with coworkers that have similar values, similar skill, well, maybe not similar, hopefully different skills, but a similar commitment to advancing the mission of of the members. At the Brewers Association, our turnover rate is very low. Um, People really like working here, and I think they believe in what we're doing.
And based on what you're doing since you began this position, how have things grown?
Well, you have to kind of take a mulligan for 2020, right? With COVID, but prior to in 2019, the Brewers Association had a staff of 66 full time employees, and we had an annual budget of around $30 million. 2020, our annual revenues dropped to $10 million. So 2020 was very, very difficult for the association. We had to let go of a third of our staff. But 2021, we're back on our feet, and we, through the good fortune of strong management by the staff, by the board, we had ample, in the association world, of what is known as financial reserves when COVID hit. So even though our revenues dropped by 2/3 and we had to let go of a third of our staff, we had sufficient financial reserves to weather that storm. And this year, we're looking at probably annual revenues of around $19 million, so almost double where we were in 2020, and we'll be budgeting for 2022 to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 to $27 million. So we have grown as the industry has grown, and it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? But the number of breweries have grown, our membership has grown, number of breweries has grown, our events have grown, and number of breweries have grown, our revenues have grown. And what we try to do is, when we generate more revenue, we try to find new programs and projects that we can execute as a staff that benefit our members. I could name so many of those. One example would be, 5-10 years ago, we did not do hardly anything on what we would call, technical brewing research. And what I mean by that is, barley and hops are the, fundamental raw materials necessary to produce great beer. When we started generating more revenue, we started funding research in the fields of barley and hops. And so in 2019, I think our research budget was somewhere around $600,000, where we were giving grants to help our members, further down the road. We never had a full-time person in DC 10 years ago. That was me. I was the CEO, and I was the number one federal government affairs person. 5 years ago, we hired, a director of federal affairs who is based in D.C. and whose, office is literally the cafeterias of the House and Senate office buildings. Um, we were able to, hire an in-house counsel that we had never had before. We were able to hire a staff economist who, just brings data. Data is king, and every argument is more further advanced with top shelf data. So those are just a few of the examples of how we've invested in the growth of the association.
As everything grows, both the association and the demand for this more nuanced kind of beer, your stakeholders, your members are growing too, but something tells me they don't just want to grow at an unlimited rate. Something tells me they have another definition of what for them is good enough or what for them is success. Is there some common denominator across all the members in terms of what is considered success in this space?
Depends, I think, on the business model, Matt, because if you're a taproom brewery, you can make a very good living selling the beer that you make right over the bar to your customers. But you are kind of by definition constrained as to how big you'll ever be, right? You're never going to probably produce more than a couple of thousand of barrels of beer a year. Again, can make a very good living, can be very impactful in your community. And for many of our members, that is what they strive for. Other members have different definitions of success, like you mentioned. Uh, you look at a brewery like Maui and all of the, activities that they're involved in. They're a packaging brewery, yes, but they also have brew pubs. So they're a brewer, but they're also restaurateurs. They sell coffee. Now they're selling, ready to drink cocktails or distilled spirits. So they're distillers as well, and that is another path towards success. Again, so it's really tough to put say one size fits all for that question. I think again depends on the business model and depends on the individual.
I will say that I did drink several of those canned beverages in Maui, and they were delicious. So they get my seal of approval. Would it be fair to say, Bob, that as if you're involved in a growing movement like craft brew, and I'm applying it to the professional vacation rental sector, if you're a stakeholder in that game and you define your version of success, you're in a really good position to achieve it, and that maybe not defining it, perhaps starting off accidentally with no real business plan or just kind of doing things on the fly, are maybe the biggest foundational flaw?
Yeah, our members by and large are not as sophisticated as say Maui Brewing Company or Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, or take your pick. Most of our members are very small, and the owner is the brewer, is the marketing director, is the HR director, and so they don't typically already always have that that business infrastructure that you would put in place if money were not an obstacle. That they kind of add on to the house. They start with the house, but the foundation might not be as solid as it would have been if they had known from the beginning, hey, we should have this in place, we should have that in place. They've it's because it's entrepreneurship, right? These are folks that are typically they're getting financing from often from the bank or through an SBA loan, but they're also getting financing to start their business through what we call the friends and family plan, and it's often pretty shoestring to start, and then if they experience success, then they invest and you know and hiring more people and creating more jobs. And that is certainly one of been our successful messaging points and talking points is just the number of jobs that our members have created over the last 20 years, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 150,000 jobs. That message really resonates with policymakers at the state and federal level. We can really point to an industry that now has a significant economic impact, and that helps us tell our story when we're trying to influence legislation or public policy.
And not to mention the product that you sell in very much the same way that our industry works is something that makes people happy. It's an enjoyable thing to sell.
Yeah, I mean that's one characteristic of many craft brewery owners is often for them it's a second career. Many of them started as a lawyer or an engineer or something that they didn't find as fulfilling, and they transitioned to becoming a brewery owner because they wanted to do something. They wanted to make something, right? They wanted to make a product of meaning, and that's really what's fueled some folks' entry into the industry.
Bob, we started off the interview from a 40,000 foot perspective. We dove deep into the barrel hole, and we're coming back out. Last question. If you're standing in front of a whole bunch of new brewers who are considering entering this industry, having observed all the trends and knowing that they love that product and dreaming up this new business, what's the piece of advice that you share with them?
Well, we've evolved a lot, but the number one piece of advice that I would share is don't enter the industry or the community if you cannot produce world-class beer in a safe brewery environment. Everybody thinks that their beer is the best, and that's okay. You should think your beer is good, but not all beers are created equal, and some people don't know all the things you need to do to make sure that your beer is world class. An example of that would be, Matt, is, there's a reason that beer from the big multinational breweries always tastes the same every time you have it. And that's because their quality control program is top shelf. Many craft breweries' quality control program is suspect. Some craft breweries, I don't want to say many, but some don't have a lab in their brewery to do laboratory analysis of their beer and to be able to detect off flavors before they put it in the package. So number one piece of advice is invest in the infrastructure so that you can have a quality control program, you can have a sensory program, and that you can make world-class beer, because those are now table stakes to survive in a very competitive industry.
What a lovely note to end on, and such a thought-provoking conversation with Bob in general. I'd like to ask for a special favor at the end of this conversation. If you're still listening to this point, chances are you may be a little bit thirsty. I'd love to know your craft beer of choice. I've been doing more and more research into this movement, and naturally, one part of that is tasting all of the unique and personality-driven beers around our country and the world. So shoot me an email, Matt with 2 T's, at vrmb.com with your favorite craft brew of choice. And let me know if you had any additional thoughts on how Bob's insight and the craft brew movement as a whole can help our highly fragmented industry, our group of independent owners and managers, build something more meaningful together.